I'd now like to open the floor to both our audience in the room as well as our online audience for questions and comments. Could you please identify yourself and any affiliation you might have, and keep your comments or questions brief and to the point. I'll take two or three, and then we'll refer them to our panelists. Gwen and Brian, are you still there? Oh. We seem to have lost our Rome-based panelists. Sorry about that. Anyway, let's open the floor. Any questions or comments?
Sorry, we are still here. We just had you on mute.
Oh. Yes, a lot of people do that, Brian. No, well, we're glad you're still with us. So we're opening up to questions and comments now. I'll take two or three and then refer them to the panelists. Yes, sir.
Yes,
sir.
My name is Akin Akiboye. I'm a PhD student from the University of Wengen, for the Netherlands. Now, my question is, the question goes to Paul. When you say something about, responsibility within the government to actually, come back to the public to actually tell them if they have spent the money reasonably. But my concerns are, government actually, tend to actually create unnecessary, humanitarian disaster in a country. For example, we have seen what happened in Afghanistan, what is happening now in Libya, for the purpose of us, from the humanitarian community, to be able to cope is too cumbersome. We will not be able to cope when government decided to actually implement unpopular policies. Could you please expatiate on that? Why exactly government would like to create an atmosphere that will not give us the opportunity to be able to undo any humanitarian disaster?
Okay, thank you. Do you want to?
We'll take several.
Yes, we'll take several before we go on. There's a gentleman here and lady here.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Peter Gleason. I'm a freelance consultant. I've been associated with this humanitarian accountability debate now for maybe 8 to 10 years. I've drafted position papers for MSF in the past when I was working for them. I have a question for Jenny on two things you mentioned in your wrap-up. One is this unrelenting demand for results by DFID, and related that to the discussion on collective accountability. In French, there is no word for accountability. It is equated with the term responsibility. Mm-hmm. When you link responsibility for results to the need for a collective accountability, you arrive at a point where you have to recognize that there is a collective responsibility for results, including the donors, the implementing organizations, the local governments, and all other actors that are involved in a humanitarian response action. It would be interesting to hear a little bit more. And then, of course, there are also issues at the policy level and on funding decisions. If you throw all these responsibilities in the mix, you get quite a complicated picture for who is responsible and therefore accountable for results, particularly at the impact level. So I'd be interested to hear from Jenny a little bit more about your position on that point.
Thank you. I think you can, pass it up here. And then we'll take one more after that, Jerome.
Thank you. My name is Christina Labor. I'm a senior researcher with the One World Trust. We conduct research and consultancy work with international organisations on issues of accountability and governance. And we particularly work with INGOs and humanitarian organisations. Quite often when we're doing consultancy work with humanitarian organisations, one of the challenges we come up against is that there's a certain reluctance among field staff, sometimes middle management, senior management, about why they should be spending the resources and time implementing these accountability policies. And I think that's something Paul touched on as well. Obviously, we like to convey the normative value, that it's a moral thing to do, as well as the instrumental value, that there can be practical benefits. And we hear a lot of case studies, such as the ones that David was mentioning, about where feedback mechanisms, for example, have improved programming design and so forth. What I would really feel there's a need for is a kind of comprehensive study of where accountability mechanisms can have a sustained effect on the impact that programming does in a humanitarian context. I don't feel that's there at the moment, and I feel it would be really useful in trying to kind of convey the importance of what we're discussing here today.
Thank you. Let's let Jerome ask his questions, and then we'll refer to our panelists.
Yes, thank you very much. Jeroen Jansen from MSF UK. Well, I'm just going to go on where you left off, One World, because I'm wondering, we are very good in finding the challenges and the tensions and the difficulties and, even the effectiveness of accountability systems and recommendations for improvements. But I don't know how we did that, because we don't know if there's any impact on our beneficiaries. We actually don't know if there's any positive or negative impact on our beneficiaries doing accountability. So maybe we should do that first before we continue with finding improvements and challenges and tensions, and get on with that one first.
Thank you. Now, there were a couple of specific questions addressed to specific individuals. So I'm going to start in the order in which they were mentioned, and then, David and Gwen and Brian can comment on any of these. Paul, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a very interesting point, and one which I think goes beyond my ability or the amount of time to answer in full. I think my sense of what you're saying is that maybe we need to disaggregate this a little bit. There are actions that take place in the humanitarian space which are not entirely always congruent with humanitarian principles. And I think speaking to those, I think to a degree hard cases make bad law. Yeah? And it's probably not good to be trying to establish an architecture on the outliers or the extreme examples. So I would be more comfortable talking in the area of where actually all of the various stakeholders are trying to fulfill humanitarian principles, rather than those examples where there are some who are not. Because even there, even when everyone is trying to do the right thing, often they are trying to do different, under this heading of accountability. I think one of the challenges that we see is that different people are trying to do different right things for different reasons. And all of those different right things for different reasons are being packaged into the same fairly small set of activities, which puts an incredible weight on those activities to actually fulfill all of these objectives for a variety of different stakeholder groups. And I think that is a challenge which I'm quite happy to point out, but not to resolve. I'll leave that to others. If I could just respond to the point about identifying the tensions, identifying where is the functional argument for this? If there is a good a priori argument that it should do that, listening to people is a good thing, listening to people, we should get better programs. I think there's a very exciting, quite interesting example from Karen Beattie in here of where it doesn't quite always work that way, and there's that rather nice example in HPN. So should we know more about what the impact on the programmatic impact of this expenditure is should that be a structured, however difficult it would be to do, I think, should that be a structured investigation into the positive and negative effect of this? Absolutely and wholeheartedly yes, of course. If we found that it didn't actually make a huge amount of difference in terms of programmatic impact, would we not continue to do it anyway? I don't know.
Thanks, Paul. Jenny?
Results. Not an exact science, and obviously, you know, you raise some difficult questions there about collective accountability or responsibility. But I think, I mean, one way that we have been thinking this through within the DFID context is thinking through, you know, there are certain results that you can articulate at a project level. There are certain results that you can use as sort of nominal results for an agency level, and then you can try and articulate what that adds up to for a system. So coordination, leadership, you know, those are things right at the top of the humanitarian system that you want to see progress on, but exactly who plays what role in getting there is more difficult to define. But I mean, there are ways of building that into accountability mechanisms. We develop business cases for all of the funding that we give to particular organisations, and when developing those, we are also thinking through how they are playing their role within the broader system, and we have that conversation with the agency. So it's not just about what UNICEF delivers in a humanitarian context, for example, it's also about how they play their role in coordination mechanisms or you know, cluster roles, etc., etc. So there are different ways of building it in, I think, in different levels, but it's not an exact science.
Okay. Gwen and Brian, are you there?
We are here.
You're there. Okay, you've muted me again. Oh dear. Now, would you? Are there any of the? Would you like to comment on any of the questions or comments?
Well, we've been reading some of the comments that have been coming over the text that's coming up. I don't know. Is it time to respond to some of those or no?
Sure.
Well, just one quick response maybe to one. I think there was a question raised about value for money. And it is a good question, and obviously there is a price to pay when you do want to develop these accountability systems, and particularly it tends to be quite human resources heavy because you need to have people on the ground following these things. But I think in our understanding, at least what's come across clearly in a number of cases at least, is that in engaging with communities and really sitting down and having a dialogue and working with them, and ideally, obviously, in their local language, through partners or whatever is the most appropriate way to be communicating with them, that there is this knock-on effect of increased trust, increased understanding by the agencies themselves of what they're getting involved with and what these communities are doing and how they've been operating up until the disaster has taken place. And then as a consequence of that, I think we can really concretely point to the fact that there's increased security for staff, for operations as they go out to deliver. So I think there we do have some very good examples and good learned lessons from past experience where we can point to this being a really good practice that we should build on.
Okay,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, Gwen, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and maybe just to build on it, there's a question about needing evidence of a sustained effect on humanitarian operations. And it leads on from what Brian has just been saying. I think the sustained effect has been proven through programming. I think the Tier Fund presentation, for example, really articulated that well. We've seen ECB projects, we've seen other projects across the world where we've really seen a shift in how we're working better with communities. There's a better understanding of what needs are, and fundamentally in an emergency we're there to respond to those needs in the most effective way possible. I think what we need to do now is take the next step, which is the common accountability, or what was referred to as mutual accountability, and really engaging together as humanitarian organisations in the response. And I don't think we've done that yet in a systematic way, and I think that's what we need to look at. But I'd go a step further than Paul in saying that this is about performance. It's not only about mutual accountability, but it's ensuring performance of the various parts of the humanitarian system, whether it's sectors or clusters or whatever you want to call it, that we're really thinking about how that we're looking at the performance of different organizations based on how they're listening and working with communities. I disagree with the speaker from MSF who said the most important thing is to do is listen. I think this is the whole point of doing this, and engagement. This is really the linchpin to this whole idea. And if we can build the accountability to affected populations into the performance appraisals, into the expected performance of the cluster and of the system as a whole, I think only then will we really be taking the next step, and that's, I think, where we're hoping we move forward in the IASC.
Thank you. The question, just to be clear, the question that Brian was responding to was from Ben Mountfield, a consultant in Thailand, and he was asking, do we believe in accountability for its own sake, or is there an expectation that it aims to measure some of the value in value for money? And he'd also addressed this to Jenny, and so I might just let her do that. I'm going to read out another rather long one for David, so he's going to have his chance to respond. Did you get that, Jenny?
No, could you just say the last bit again?
Yeah. Do we believe in accountability for its own sake, or is there an expectation that it aims to measure some of the value in value for money?
Mm-hmm. Is it just efficiency? Right. Well, I mean, obviously that's an individual response as to what we believe, but from a DFID perspective, I mean, I would say coming from the analysis in the humanitarian emergency response review, that was coming from both perspectives. It wasn't per se making a moral argument. But it was talking about the rightness of improving our conversation with beneficiaries, and that obviously is for efficiency and performance issues, as Gwen points out, but also because those are the people that you are trying to improve your performance to help. So, I mean, it depends who we is as to what the answer to that is, and some organisations will emphasise the moral argument more or less vis-a-vis the efficiency argument, but it's a well-rehearsed debate, and the presumption is that both are important, actually.
Okay, I'm going to read out another question from Kevin Savage with World Vision International. He's a humanitarian research coordinator in Geneva. Kevin said, regarding the point about effort to sidestep community leaders, and this is directed specifically at David, and concern that there is a way for non-leaders to communicate in some way, how much do we know the extent to which this is worth doing and when? It seems to me that it's a bit futile to think that the power structures and relationships in a community are something that can be changed in our context of work. Although Paul wondered whether empowerment may indeed be something we start addressing, which I'd agree is what accountability is truly about. So I'm curious about the effectiveness of efforts to temporarily sidestep such leaders to get input about their constituencies. Does that actually lead to significantly improved or better, more valuable feedback from affected people? And lead to action or change that is different? Compared with feedback that is gained from leaders? Because it's likely to be more costly than simply dealing through existing systems of representation and could raise problems. So how much and when is it worth doing? Now that's a lot.
Yeah, nice, easy question. So, I mean, I think for me, absolutely key consideration, for me it boils down very much to how much we're taking seriously our commitment to targeting of the most vulnerable. So if we're just saying, well, help the community, we'll talk to the leaders and tick the box that we've done our impartiality targeting bit, I don't think that's sufficient. And if we're serious about targeting the marginalised, the most vulnerable, that requires us to think carefully about the appropriate approach to participation and assessment, project design, feedback, and so on. But I do think the point is very well made about how the sidestepping approach, how realistic is that? How meaningful is it? I think that will vary by context. There may be some power structures in place where you're just not going to change anything, but you can work around it a little bit to try and reach those most in need. I can think of examples, I think it was Sierra Leone, where a village chief was removed by their village for not demonstrating appropriate leadership in targeting and so on. So there are cases where change can take place, rightly or wrongly, through interventions of humanitarian agents. And I think a lot is as well to do with the length of the presence of the organisation on the ground. So if you're in there for a 3-month distribution, that's very different to a 6-year intervention, where one can look at appropriate methods of participation, feedback, and not just sidestep, but look to new ways of seeing meaningful engagement and ownership by those who are most vulnerable.
Thanks, David. Now I've got 2 people, Nigel and John, and another gentleman here. So let's take that round of questions and comments. So back here. Thank you.
Thank you. Nigel Timmins with Christian Aid. This is probably targeted more towards Gwen and Brian, but interested in anyone's opinion on the panel. We've talked about transforming information flows in humanitarian responses, increased demands for transparency, increasingly many voices challenging our legitimacy, and also perhaps thinking to, for example, Haiti and the multiplicity of complaints mechanisms all sort of, piled up on the fence next to each other because of the multiplicity of actors. I've just come back from a peer review of one of our sister agencies in the ACT Alliance, who had funded the Pakistani Human Rights Commission to run independent complaints handling centres. And I just wonder, as we sort of cogitate on all this, whether the feeling is that the attitude to accountability in the sector has moved forward enough that the old idea of the humanitarian ombudsman could in some way, shape or form be rekindled.
Thank you. John, I think you can just pass it forward. There you go.
Yeah. John Mitchell from ALNAP. Just a little bit of information and a very quick question. And the information is relating to this issue about should accountability be used in the measurement of performance. And I'm just picking up on the issue that Gwen raised there in Rome. And just to say, Gwen, that there is actually an analytical framework that ALNAP has developed called the Balanced Scorecard, where there is an accountability element in the scorecard which contributes to the measurement of performance. So there is actually a framework out there. And my very quick question was to David. I just really wondered what happened to that poor doctor you put out of business.
I'm afraid I can't answer that immediately, but I will look into it for you.
Just here.
Hi, Craig Dean from Plan International. I'm just curious as to how much of the accountability stuff could be moved to before the emergency context, and what the thoughts are on that. So, actually communicating to populations on who will do what beforehand, particularly for cyclical emergencies, flooding, those type of things, and how that could be communicated better. So, when the humanitarian context is upon us, people aren't running around trying to tell everyone what they're doing, but it's clear beforehand what populations should expect from which actors, and how the government and the international agencies are working together, and how they can report back that. Ideally led through a government system, or if that's not in place, a UN system where they hold us to account.
Okay,
Thank you.
Now, anybody have one last burning question or comment before we refer them back to the panel? Yes. A quick one.
Hello everyone, I'm Sneha Krishnan, a PhD student at UCL. I had quite a lot of burning questions, but the one that I'll stick to is this idea that humanitarian accountability in terms of emergencies. When the situation is so dynamic, you couldn't predict how the situation is going to change. How do you stick to your programmatic goals which you had laid out in the end? It refers to Paul's point saying that how do you stick to your log frame or to the beneficiary on the ground? What can we do as implementing agencies? What is the way ahead? Yeah. Thank you.
Or whether you need to stick to your log frame, I suppose, is really the question. Okay, I'm going to start with David, since he was last time. He'll be first this time.
Maybe if I could answer that question. So I think that's a really key consideration. and I do think it challenges our emphasis on the log frame. So this is a challenge for ourselves as grant-making organisations to local partners, as well as perhaps to institutional government donors. But I do think we need to challenge ourselves in asking, in a situation of dynamic change, what is in the best interests of those we are serving, disaster survivors. And if the assessment of a month ago said these were our priorities and those have changed, then surely the last thing we should be doing is sticking to what the log frame says when we know full well the dynamics have moved on and there's a different set of priorities. So I think we need to look to ourselves, Tier Fund included. We must change our messaging to our local partners, frontline staff, to be dynamic with the changing situation. And if that means updating the log frame, let's do it.
Thank you, David. Gwen and Brian, would you like to comment or respond to any of the questions?
Yeah, we could. There was one question I think directed directly at us, and this question of the multiplicity of actors, and
yes.
then was the timing right as well for returning to the idea that was floated, I think, a while ago, the ombudsman idea. The multiplicity of actors is of course, a big challenge, and that's one of the things we're trying to get a handle on and trying to bring this common framework together, is that we'll have a basis for, hopefully, a large proportion at least of an operation that they can utilize and have this common understanding. The other part of it is that we often have seen that there are multiple systems of feedback put in place in specific locations which can confuse or can just add further complication and unnecessary problems for people that, where it could be very simple and singular. But that's a challenge in itself, and that's obviously something that we have to get a handle on. The other point that I think we didn't mention earlier was that we've also been very clearly informed that there's a clear difference between feedback and complaint. And feedback takes many forms. Obviously, it can even be positive feedback, encouragement to do more things that we've been doing. Whereas complaints often have a confidential nature. They often end up in the agency that they're directed at, handling them individually through their own complaints mechanisms, and it's not handled in a common way. Whereas feedback may be more open and discussed perhaps amongst the country team or others. So we need to make a very clear distinction between what we call feedback and what we call complaints, and often they're of sexual exploitation or abuse issues and these sort of things we need to be sensitive to. Now, the ombudsman idea is something that has surfaced again in our discussions, and it's something we have put forward as one possible means of improving accountability. But we see this as part of a bigger system. That's just one element of it. And really what we would hope through our work is that managers themselves take on accountability, and that agencies empower their managers to be more proactive in doing that. And that if there is a failure in that system somehow, then an ombudsman idea or person or mechanism would come into play. It's a bit of an oversight mechanism. It's not something that we see necessarily standing on its own, but rather works with the system that is put in place. I'll turn to Gwen for anything further.
No, I mean, I think just to talk in terms of the multiplicity of actors, I think that is key, and I mean that is the added value of the humanitarian system. And I think we also have to be careful. We're not trying to push every organisation into a common framework. The idea is to try and maintain that diversity and that understanding, but promote some common understanding. And those expectations would come from individual organisations rather than necessarily something superimposed down from the IAC.
Thanks, Gwen and Brian. Jenny.
Just a couple of very brief points. I mean, firstly, to say on the sort of, could we inform people ahead of a disaster happening what their expectations of the system or of particular actors could be? Yes, and I think there's some really good practice out there on the disaster risk reduction side. I mean, as to whether that goes into the explicit role and expectation side of things, not necessarily so, but it's a good reminder that it could. And I guess going with that, we need to make sure that we're anticipating better where disasters are most likely to happen, so that we can prepare those communities the best possible way. And on the sort of adaptability question, I think absolutely we need collectively to be adaptable and to flex and change our approach where necessary. And in relation to the log frame, of course, we talk about partnership a lot, but that's where it becomes real. You know, if you need to change your activities on the ground, then you need to communicate back to whoever you're reporting to that needs to happen, and the log frame remains a living document. That's the theory anyway, but it's important that that's a reality too.
Thank you. And Paul, last but not least.
Thank you. On this idea of if you like, accountability preparedness, it would be fascinating to hear from agencies what work's been done in that area already, because I'm sure there must have been some, possibly from plan, and it of course makes perfect sense. It adds up to, you know, a really good idea. I think it backs up some of the work that we've seen in the lessons learned paper we've been doing about droughts at ALNAP, which is, you know, that there is where there is continuity of actors between, if you like, developmental and relief work, and either because, you know, you have the local partners being brought on, or because it's the same agencies who are actually moving through that, or where flexible funding is allowed, so that the same agency can move from one thing to another. Then those relationships have already been established, expectations have been established, and it would tend to, again, we don't have necessarily any evidence for this, but it would tend to, you know, one would tend to think that it would make more sense, and that you know, that would be a good preparatory thing to do. The point also made me think that in terms of preparatory accountability, preparing for accountability, I mean, so much of what we've been talking about today is in fact looking at accountability as a way of addressing the fact that there is a very steep gradient of power in these you know, humanitarian responses. Some people have got a lot, and some people have got hardly any at all. And the more actors who come into this, the more complex that gradient becomes, because it's not just one, but several different interlocking sets of sort of stairways. And I was just thinking, and maybe it's a challenge for us all, is, you know, in a slightly utopian way, but one of the things that the sector is about is turning utopia into, getting that one step closer to utopia, perhaps, is actually, you know, preparatory accountability might be about preparatory consideration of those steep power gradients, and what is it that one might do about those.
Thank you, Paul. We're just over time now, and so I'm going to have to bring this session to a close. I wanted to thank our panelists for making the time today to come and spend with us. We had some fascinating presentations. I think some really good questions and comments from the audience as well. And again, thank you to our online audience for bearing with us, as I think the majority of them actually turned up at 1 o'clock. So apologies for the mix-up. And Gwen and Brian, thanks very much to you for bearing with the technology issues. We really appreciate your participation, even by Skype. So those of you who are in the room, please do stay and join us for refreshments on the other side of this partition, which we're shortly to open. And thank you again.